Welcome to the Natural Growing Through Biology podcast. I'm Steve.
I'm Dennis, and today we're going to talk about post-harvest nutrition.
Are we?
I think that's what we're going to talk about. It changes every week, hour,
We
day.
don't really know.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about some stuff. So the idea of post-harvest, we think about, okay, great. I've done all this work. I've done everything I can to get the best crop, the best yield, everything I can out of my soil. And I harvest. I'm done now, right? That's all I have to do.
Well, in reality, it's kind of like a bear going into hibernation. We want to get as much food
Want to
in
fatten it
these
up.
plants,
Mhm.
get them ready for that long winter as we possibly can. And this is the most important time of year.
Bring on the
when we
vitamin
start to talk it.
donuts.
Exactly.
Vitamin donuts. So some examples, we have some questions or some general things that we hear pretty regularly. I'm going to read a couple of those off and we'll kind of, as we're chatting through, kind of answer some of these. So how should I treat my plants or trees or soil after harvest, prepare them for the next growing season? When should I start irrigating after harvest? And how late into the season can I continue applying nutrition or a foliar or both? And those are kind of some topics that we wanted to touch on. And those are questions that we get fairly regularly. So this idea of foliar nutrition, proficient performance in plants strongly associated with distinct microbial communities that live in or on the plant's organs. The foliar microbiome highlights its importance for plants' ecosystemic functioning and crop yield. So basically what that's boiling down to is when we're talking about this foliar system, this phylosphere, this microbiome, the phylobiome, we need to keep in mind this is an ecosystem. This is a living system, just like your skin. Your body is coated in organisms. Same with a plant. But a lot of the things that we do can change who's there and how they're growing, how well they're growing. So when we start to use copper or sulfur or anything that's an antibiotic, anything that harms life, we're changing those organs. We're changing who's there. Even just the applications of different materials is going to change who there. Is it a salt-based fertilizer? Does it have a lot of carbon in it? Are we doing things to help establish those organisms? Or are we doing things to kind of harm those organisms? So keeping that in mind, we want to do everything we can to establish that biology on the phylosphere, just like we talk about our rhizobiome, those plant growth promoting rhizobacteria. We want those roots coated and surrounded with these beneficial organisms because they're doing a wide variety of beneficial things for the plant. These phylosphere organisms, and we talked a little bit last time on our foliar phylosphere podcast. So this time, I guess I've gotten off track. We're supposed to be talking about post-harvest, and I'm focusing on maintaining and building that organism, that organ, the leaf organ, and maximizing the phylosphere organisms that are associated with it, so we can reap all those benefits from those organisms.
Well, it's a good point, though, Steve, because we have to think about it all year long, because this functions entirely throughout the year. And then we want to really focus this now on the post-harvest, or once we've taken that fruit off of the tree, because so often, like you say, as we had said earlier, once we harvest that block, we want to go on to the next block that needs to be harvested, or the next thing that needs to be done.
Out of sight, out of mind, buddy.
Yeah, and so often I talk to growers, the most important time of that foliar application, and we really can talk about it, is once we shut the water off, we stress the trees a little bit, we got people climbing through them, picking the apples, doing whatever, and in that scenario they're a little bit stressed, and they're
a little bit,
and it's really critical at this time of year, these post-harvest applications, providing nutrition to that plant to recover from that season and from that growing stress that really we've put on in this through this whole harvest process, I guess it is. So a lot of times, one of our questions is, when do I water? How often do I water? And, what do I do for my trees after the harvest? And usually what I communicate to my growers is, as soon as we're done harvesting, the first thing we want to do is turn on that water, get water back into that profile. A lot of times at that time, I'm talking about, adding our biology, adding a little bit of fish, adding a little food to get that soil going. But this is, now that we've got that irrigation on, we've got some moisture back in the trees, this is when we want to start our post-harvest foliar application, because that is critical actually at reducing that stress and setting up this plant to go through that long winter. And these post harvests are so important from the idea of building nutritional reserves to survive that winter so that they can basically not only go through the winter well, but then also be ready to come out of spring. They have energy to push out of spring or out of dormancy in the spring.
So that's like your bear example. It's the idea, and that works really, really well on trees. But when we're talking about soil, it's a little bit different because we don't have quote unquote tissue to rebuild. So in those cases, when we're talking about building our soil for next year, it's carbon. I mean, I feel like, when is the last time we had a presentation we didn't say the importance of carbon? Have we ever not said the importance of carbon?
I think we talk about carbon a little bit.
Every once in a while.
Every once in a while we mention it.
That is true. So getting that carbon out there, and that's going to do so many things. You were talking about water. As we know from USDA and RCS, every percentage of organic matter is going to give us that close to 30,000 gallons of water. So doing that carbon application, not only is it going to help feed the plant's going to hold on to water, and in this case, sometimes a little bit of sugar. It can be appropriate. Our plants are stressed. Whenever our plants are stressed, a little bit of sugar can help feed those plants so that they don't have to produce that. They can utilize some of that as basically a free meal, and that can help get their photosynthesis up and running. You can start kick their exudate profiles back into gear, so they can start getting the soil microbiome back up and functioning, so they can start extracting from the soil again. So like we've talked about, this idea of doing a foliar helps feed the plant from both the foliar as well as the soil really comes into play.
Because see, I thought you were saying you wanted to go out and foliar feed the soil.
We can try.
Well, and that's, if you think about it, that's really what we're doing. We're applying a foliar application to our trees and shrubs, or any of these crops growing after harvest, because really we're applying foliar nutrition or exudates down into that soil environment, which is soil food.
Yeah,
as you were just talking
building
about.
that tissue, building those exudates, working and utilizing that microbial carbon pump to build that system, to build those microaggregates, to build that for the soil, and build that soil for next year.
Yeah, and one of the reasons this is so critically important, not only for overall tree health, but setting it up for going into the winter and then coming out with that energy for next spring. But we have already started to set next year's crop.
Yes.
Everything is in motion for basically our harvest, our yield for the next season. So we've just taken a lot of energy out of these plants. Now we have to utilize that and make sure that, I mean, it's a mother. Basically, it is starting to take care of its crop throughout the rest of this season, and everything we can do nutritionally wise to build that overall plant health into these trees and shrubs is going to be a direct correlation of yield next year.
Well, and so the idea of alternate bearing, does that have anything to do with this idea of nutrition?
You know, Bruce used to talk a lot about that on alternate bearing plants, and obviously some varieties are maybe a little more susceptible to that than others. But it all comes down to the carrying capacity of that plant based on its nutrition. And if we balance out that nutrition, we reduce the susceptibility to that alternate bearing scenario. And I always talk to growers, it doesn't matter whether we're talking wheat or corn, or we're talking fruit trees, or we're talking cherries. If we can balance out that nutrition and look at that 5-year average of yield, it really starts to pay for itself in the long run. Because when I start to, every grower that I've talked to, and I've been talking about this for a long time, of that most important application is that one directly after harvest. And it's just amazing the significant difference it can make in the next year's yield, not only in number of fruits, sizing, spur distance, all of those things that we look at, growth, all of those things that we look at. It really starts right now at this time of year, because, you know, it really shows that the plant actually has that energy, not only to build that crop. And we talk about, when I start to talk about energy, I start to think about things that we struggle with in the plant that we can't get enough of, like our calcium. You know, we start to think about, when do I start applying calcium? I get that question all the time. And really, right now, is a great time. After harvest, start applying your calcium, start applying your trace minerals, start applying everything based off of your data that you've pulled for that year, based off your plant sap analysis. That should be your first foliar application.
Build those reserves, restock that pantry so it's ready to go for next year.
Yeah, because really, if we don't start doing that, really what happens is it can get kind of ugly. You know, when I start to talk about it, I've referred to it a lot as the Isle of Death. Foliar nutrition basically helps not only increase cold tolerance, increase overall plant health, but when we start to talk about that broader picture of insect diseases, all of those things that we're susceptible to, all are nutrition related, or a lot of that is nutrition related.
Yes.
A lot of times it expresses itself because of an excess and or a deficiency caused by an excess being expressed by that tree. So when we start to talk about the big picture of overall plant health, I mean, really, this time of year can really ward off a lot of problems throughout the next growing season.
Yeah, insects and disease, they're not an accident. Listening to Tom Dykstra, Francis Chaboso, Callahan, looking at some of that research, looking at some of that information, we start to realize that we're basically asking to go down the aisle of death. You don't want to think about it that way, and it's a pretty harsh way to think about it, but a lot of these stresses that end up coming to the plants could have been mitigated. Yeah, I know there's some abiotic stresses that if Mother Nature hits you with hail, and then in a week later hits you with hail, there wasn't much you could do about that. And you're going to have damage, and then your saprophytes are going to come in, and they're going to start doing their job, because these organisms, these weeds, these pests, these saprophytes, these fungal pathogens, they have a job. Nature has them there for a purpose, and a lot of times it's just recycling more than attrition. It's just not necessarily how we want it or how the farmer wants it to be done. We don't want those saprophytes growing at the wrong time. We don't want those fungal pathogens tearing our roots apart and our plants apart. So keeping ourselves out of the aisle of death is a lot about preventative. It's focusing on what does the plant need, and recognizing, like you were just saying, utilizing some of that leaf extract analysis, utilizing that data to tell us, oh man, year after year, I'm seeing, based on my analysis, it comes into June and July, and all of a sudden I'm out of manganese. Well, if we know that's going to be a problem, now is a good time to restock some of those shelves and get some of that nutrition out there, isn't it?
Yeah, and so a lot of times, like I say, at this time of year, you know, your first foliar application right after harvest, as soon as after harvest you can do, even when you're rotating into other blocks to pick other fruit, have somebody designated out there that can go through and do that foliar application on whatever block we have just harvested. And the amazing part about that is a lot of times I say, well, how many foliar applications should I do in the fall? And a lot of times it's like, how much time do I have?
How many can you do?
Yeah. So, you know, coming in with 2 or 3 good foliars, after, you know, if we look at cherries, obviously that harvest is much earlier than we are in our apples. So a lot of times it dictates at what can we do based off of those foliar applications, based on just what environment dictates. But the more foliars we can do within that fall growing season, again, they're going to pay for themselves tenfold when it comes out to overall plant performance that next spring and in that next crop growing season.
Are there any nutrients or forms? Is there anything that you typically tell people this is a you must do, or these are things that you should definitely avoid? And we can kind of take those however you want to. I mean, the one that pops into my mind right out of the gates late season is nitrogen.
Yeah, I mean, I look at late season, we want to get a little bit of balance. I always say balanced nutrition based off it.
We want to dust it on.
We want a little bit of everything. A lot of times, you know, again, I look at in the fall application, maybe rotating a little bit between calcium and potassium. You know, Bruce used to talk about potassium being the antifreeze of the plant world.
Absolutely.
You know,
seaweed is a great way to do that.
Seaweed is exactly. And so, you know, we just went through there. A lot of times when we size our fruit and we do all those types of things, you know, we've
Depleted?
Depleted, thank you.
Sure.
We didn't deplenish, we depleted.
We can try to deplenish.
We want to, see, I was saying deplenish because I was saying depleted and replenished at the same
Ah.
time. So I made up a new word. It's probably going to be in the dictionary soon.
So if you're going opposite direction, you're going nowhere.
Yeah.
If you're depleting and replenishing at the same time, then you're just stuck.
So what I'm doing is I am replenishing
You're
the
depleting.
depletion.
Oh boy.
That's what I was trying to say anyway.
Sure.
But you know, and a lot of times at this time, I often talk to growers and recommend that postseason planning is a lot about evaluating yourself.
Yes.
And I do that
What
every
worked?
year.
What didn't work?
Yeah, and with growers, what
Mhm.
worked, what didn't work, what things could I do different, what things do I need to make a note of? Because it's a really good time. You know, I mean, we're talking about foliar nutrition, but part of this foliar nutrition is basically evaluating. It's a time for us to evaluate what we did during this season, not only our program,
Yeah.
what went well, what didn't, what things can we change starting with our foliar applications right after harvest that we want to kind of do better. And then again, look at our test results based off of the idea of how was our harvest, how was our sizing, and what nutritionally things should I be doing differently? Because these are all questions that we kind of have to ask ourselves when we build this foliar program in order for it to be successful.
Absolutely. And I know that we've been talking a lot about foliar. Are there some nutrients post-harvest fall that you'd like to put out through irrigation or down on the ground that seem to work better or can save you some budget?
Well, a lot of times what I look at in the fall application again is I'm combining based off of soil analysis and flat sap analysis.
yep.
I'm trying to see what the plant is telling me.
So you're testing, not guessing.
Well, usually.
Okay.
But a lot of times what I also look at from the standpoint of my biological applications is what biology am I going to apply into that soil environment? You know, based off to help that plant get the nutrition it needs. And a lot of times I look at that based off of where are my deficiencies.
Yeah.
Do I, you know, am I going to use some maybe nitrogen fixers late in the fall, or am I going to more pay attention to my phosphate solubilizers, or am I just doing a balanced application of a broad spectrum, hopefully get some calcium made available to basically, if you think about it based off the tissue of the plant, we've also dried that plant out. We've stressed that plant. We've done the exact same thing to the soil environment. The exact same that was occurring in the upper part of that plant is occurring down in the bottom of that
Makes
plant.
sense.
So a lot of times, if we do that, is if we re-inoculate some of those good guys, build up that population at the same demand that now we've placed on that soil environment. And, you know, obviously harvest is usually a hot, dry time of year. And so anything we can do to enhance those microbial communities within that soil environment are going to be, you know, critical to building overall plant health.
So as early as you can, once harvest is done, you want to get that water going right away. And then you want to come in with a light but balanced foliar application of a variety of nutrients. What sort of things, okay, if we're making cookies, the cookie batter is always the same basic things. Without looking at your analysis, and I know I just said something I shouldn't say, what sort of materials are you pretty much always adding right out of the gates?
Well,
Fish.
I was going to slap you for saying not
I know,
analysis, but I'm going to let it go this time. But anyway, a lot of times what I look at is I want food for the tree and I want food for the microbes.
Okay.
So my application is generally going to be Micro 5000, which is a little bit designed on getting energy and growth back into that plant with a biological inoculant in addition to that to help those microbes on the phyllosphere of that plant. I'm going to have a little bit of fish in there. I'm going to want a little bit of fish. I might have a little bit of kelp in there just because it's a great stress reducer.
Absolutely.
And it's going to help build again on that microbial community on that plant.
Trace minerals, vitamins, minerals, hormones.
And then always at that time of year, there's going to be a little bit of nitrogen, there's going to be a little bit of calcium, and there's going to be a trace mineral package because all of those are going to be critical. If it depends on the time of year, also, a lot of times I look at, am I going to be able to get 2 foliar applications in before the end of the season, or am I only going to be able to get 1?
Okay.
If I'm going to get 2 foliar applications in before the end of the season, I'll start the first one with the micro 5000, kind of with that package we talked about. The second one's going to be PZ
More
1000.
potassium.
Yep, a little more potassium, and then I might do a little bit of nitrogen, a little bit of potassium in that application. Again, as long as we're not looking at anything in excess or creating a larger problem than we would like to. And again, always a trace mineral package. I'm always going to have that into this, because 99% of the time that I see fruit trees out there, almonds, it doesn't matter, peaches, pears, cherries, whatever it is, we have the same deficiencies. A lot of times it's calcium, and a lot of times it's trace minerals. So that's just best guess scenario, I guess, based on this conversation, is probably what I would take a look at doing.
Okay. And then we utilize the analysis so we know exactly what type of cookies we're going to make.
Yeah. And, and I want to make chocolate chip cookies.
You can't. We don't have chocolate chips.
We don't have chocolate chip?
We ran out.
Okay. And that's one of the things that we have to look at, actually, which is a really good point. A lot of times I talk to growers at this time of year and they say, well, I don't have any of that, I'm going to substitute this. Again, it's a time we need to give the plant actually what it needs. If we don't have the ingredients to bake the cookie, then let's go to the store and make sure that we have the right ingredients to bake those right cookies. Because I don't know if you've ever tried to bake cookies without flour, but it doesn't go well.
A baking soda and in place of baking powder, that sort of thing. Oh yeah, we've all done that. And when we use the wrong thing, we end up with a recipe that doesn't work. And it's the same for our plants. So we've got to be careful with what we're applying. And that kind of brings in the idea of, as we've talked about many times, excesses. We have to pay close attention to our excesses. If our plant and soil is already really dried out, we have to be cautious, we have to be careful, and we have to keep an eye on what's being piggybacked in. That vitamin donut idea, where we're loading the plant up with something that it doesn't really need because it's being piggybacked in with something that we do want. A lot of times the chloride forms are not, this isn't a great time, generally isn't a great time in our opinion for chloride forms, but especially when that plant is already kind of crispy, dried out, and stressed. Same with this soil. We're going to compound some of that with those. So utilizing, and I think you mentioned like some humates and some fulvics in there, and those can help with the energy of the plant. Those can help with balancing and buffering. So those can be good additions as well.
Well, and the fulvic is always good addition when we're talking about foliar nutrition to help with nutritional uptake.
Yeah, chelation.
The chelation of that. So it's always something very important to take a look at when we're applying those foliar applications. Because really what we need to do is we want to get the nutrition into the plant. That's why we're doing these foliar applications. That's why the addition of the biolate. That's why I'm looking at using an amino acid chelate form on our foliar applications. Why we start to look at, what things actually are going to cause an antagonism that are mixed in that foliar application. It goes back to the idea of 2 applications. If we have 2 applications, take a look at that mix and kind of rotate into what you're trying to get into that plant. A lot of times I talk to growers, sometimes we get our foliar application too complex. And I think we defeat the purpose of good nutrient uptake almost by confusing that plant. So let's keep them simple. And
what the plant really needs,
and what the plant actually really needs. And if we have to do multiple applications, if we have too many things trying to go into, it's kind of the idea of too many people in the kitchen. Same thing happens with too much in a foliar
start
application.
Having antagonisms,
in my opinion. So a lot of times is that simple application of that foliar. Even again, if we have to do 2 applications prior to the end of the year, I think that's really important. Yeah. So thank you, everybody. I just wanted to say that we really appreciate you being part of this podcast, coming and listening to us. And, I'm Dennis again. Sure. Glad to have you here on the podcast, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm Steve. Be sure to tune in next time for the Natural Growing Through Biology podcast series.